Yeah. Okay. So I'm MJ Wright from the Wayland Library, and I'm here to introduce Jane, my dear friend. Over the years, we've just bonded over history, and she's going to be speaking of Wayland and Sudbury and the dawn of the American Revolution. And we are so fortunate to have her here because for 30 years, this is what she talked about. She was a national park ranger, and she talked about the revolution. So to have her in our community is just amazing, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Are you going to take notes?
So tell me if you can hear me. And I want to thank both the Historical Society and the library for sponsoring this program. And I'm very happy to see you all here. And I just want to start with a sort of a disclaimer. The people of Sudbury were so enthusiastic and such active participants in what I call the transformation from loyal British subjects to ardent patriots that I got a little carried away, and it is probably longer than it should be. But the other thing is, it's going to have a lot of dates, it's going to have a lot of things in it that there will be no test on anything. So don't worry, just sort of get the essence of it, and then that should do it. So anyway, 250 years ago last week, a Sudbury woman by the name of Experience White Richardson recorded in her diary on March 16, 1775, "This day was fasting according to the advice of our Congress. Oh, the terribleness of the times. There looks as if there will be fighting this spring, and my son is listed with about 60 more to go fight." On April 19th, 1775, a little over a month from that entry, her son Josiah Jr. did march off to Concord, unaware of the significance of that date to a country that had not yet been born. Colonial Sudbury and Wayland today is one of only about 30 communities whose residents participated in the events of that day. I want to say something before Courtney advances the slide, and I had to work hard. This is the celebration, the 200th, the bicentennial of 1975, and I had to make sure that both sides of the river were represented. So I know one of them is, I think the others are from Sudbury, but the main one is, the one who's most visible is Palmer True, who happened to live on the street that I live on right now and have lived on for almost 50 years. So both sides of the river are represented. So now the next slide. So in both towns, we still have visible reminders of that watershed event. Buildings like the Grout Herd House in Wayland Center and the Loring Parsonage in Sudbury Center, both home to their town's respective historical society museums, fittingly, that stood witness to men going off to join the fight on April 19, 1775, the first day of the American Revolution. There are remnants of the training fields, the North Cemetery in Wayland, and Revolutionary War Cemetery in Sudbury contain and pay tribute to the men who fought that day and other veterans of the Revolutionary War. So for most of the country, Patriots' Day is, after all, only a state holiday. April 19th is overshadowed on the national level by July 4th, 1776, the date on which American colonists declared their intent to form a new nation if they won the war. Lexington and Concord take place 15 months before the Declaration of Independence is signed. The 300 plus men who left Sudbury that day were inflamed by other passions. They were largely fighting for their rights and privileges as Englishmen in America as they understood them 3,000 miles away from the seat of government in Great Britain. Today we have come full circle. Independence is a given, and liberties are still in the forefront of our concept of what it means to be an American. What kind of town did they leave on that first day of fighting? And so this is the next slide will show both sides of the river. So it is the river meadows, of course, of the Sudbury River. So Sudbury in 1775 consisted of the modern towns of Sudbury and Wayland, and included both the east and west sides of the Sudbury River. The two towns were one town, and that's what I'll refer to as colonial Sudbury. From its incorporation today, that kind of is lost on many people, that this was one town, Wayland and Sudbury, from 1639 to its division in 1780. It was the second largest town in Middlesex County, with a population of about 2,000 people together. And Boston, just to give you a perspective, had 16,000 in it, with approximately, Sudbury had approximately 800 people on the east side and a larger number on the west side. There were 250 households, 464 swine, the same number of oxen, and double that of cows growing fat on the rich river meadows. The landscape was different from today's. Some woodlots were needed for building and heating, but primarily the land was kept open for farming. As in the 1600s, local farmers still reaped the bounty of the fertile river meadows to graze their cattle that enabled them not only to satisfy their needs, but even to export beef during the Revolutionary War. So all here were Englishmen, in fact, as well as ancestry. Farmers all, even the ministers and schoolmasters, some richer, some poorer, but all mingling together. Men of property enjoyed self-government. They decided on town affairs, debated matters of taxation, and elected representatives to the Massachusetts legislature, known as the General Court. Some men were repeatedly elected to town offices and served in various capacities for many years. It was a man's world, with women, indentured servants, and enslaved persons expected to follow rules made by men, while women largely stayed at home, tending to domestic chores and child rearing. The men in town also had responsibilities toward the community they controlled. Town meeting records are filled with payments to individuals for road and frequent bridge repairs, for transporting goods from one town to another, for sweeping the schoolhouse and meeting house, and digging graves. Men from 16 to 60 were also required to serve in the town's militia, which might be called upon to defend the town from any external harm. Sudbury men had seen service during King Philip's War and the French and Indian War, so they weren't new to what it was like to have active combat. It was not a new town in 1775, but over 135 years old. Many of the settler families, the Haynes, the Noises, the Goodnows, the Lokers, Parmenters, to name a few, had descendants on the muster rolls on April 19, 1775. While they considered themselves Englishmen, they had been here long enough to equate their rights as Englishmen with the way things worked in America, in Massachusetts, and in Sudbury. It was a God-fearing community with 2 ministers supported by the town, one on each side of the river, who wielded considerable power and influence and never failed to point out God's all-pervasive influence. Drought, floods, disease were signs of God's displeasure and necessitated a call for prayers of forgiveness and repentance. Punishment for disobedience to the rules of the town was still largely governed by public humiliation, including the stocks. Public whippings also could occur. Yet it was not a town without pity, as bad as it sounds. There were poorhouse and workhouses to take care of their own who had fallen on hard times, but with an aversion to strangers who were often warned out of Sudbury and other towns so that they would never be a financial burden to a community they did not belong in. Tavern keepers were among Gretchen the most respected citizens in town, and taverns were the communication centers of the town, particularly for the men. As in Boston, it is reasonable to assume that taverns were places where the actions against the infringement of rights by the British government were discussed. Travelers brought news of other communities, responses to the same offenses, and ideas were exchanged. In keeping with their Puritan traditions, there were schools for elementary education, known as reading and writing schools, and a grammar school, their equivalent of a high school for the few who would go on to further learning. Both were funded by the town with schedules that accommodated the seasonal needs of farm work. An article about the expense of building a new school was debated in town meeting in October 1775 after the events of April 19th, with future General John Nixon taking time out of his military duties to lead petitioners who advocated building a school in the Landon district on the west side of the river. Schools and schoolings were serious business in colonial times, required by law in Massachusetts since the mid-1600s. And while everyone is aware of the impediments caused by the flooding of the river, there were other reasons leading to the division of the town in 1780. General Nixon is only one example of the stresses and strains between the older, more established east side of the river, which bore the brunt of the tax burden, and the newer, more populous west side of the river. And while both sides joined together in protesting the actions of the British government, on April 19, 1775, men from the east and west sides of the river went off separately to different destinations in Concord. Together, they made up the largest contingent of men who fought that day. Even as the town dealt with issues leading to the outbreak of war on April 19, 1775, routine matters predominated at town meetings. In May 1773, a town meeting took up the issue of a youthful group of Sudbury men who were known as horse cheaters. Persons who go about the country, I'm quoting, cheating honest men by purchasing their horses, cattle, and other effects by telling them fair stories and promising short pay. They were punished by that good old public humiliation that I spoke of earlier. Their names were published in several newspapers that the public, quote again, may be cautioned against trading with or trusting them on any account. they would all later find outlets for their youthful spirits as soldiers in the Revolutionary War. And then the next slide, thank you, is in early January 1775, so only several months before April 19th, March, town meeting set up a pest house encouraging inoculations, fearing the spread of the smallpox epidemic in Boston, which did soon spread to Sudbury. And even as late as January 1775, town meeting started off with 9 mundane matters. And the first was to elect officers, to see if the town will give liberty for horses to go at large without fetters, to see if the sheep will go at large, to give liberty to the swine to go at large, to grant money for the repair of highways, to see if the town will accept the settlement of the selectmen with the town treasurer, to pay John Noyes for land where the town roads go, to post notices for meetings on each of the meeting houses, and to accept the list of jurors. And only on the 10th article do we get an inkling of the impending crises. And this is a quote from the town meeting minutes. To see what encouragement the town will give to their Minutemen when they are properly enlisted according to the advice of the Provincial Congress, or do and act any other way as the town shall think proper when met. So in the 12 years between the end of the last French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, in 1763, and the start of the Revolution in April of 1775, political and military affairs occupied a great deal of the thoughts and actions of the townspeople. The town of Sudbury is fortunate to have 2 sources of information that detail the transformation of the citizens of Sudbury from proud Englishmen to ardent American patriots. The most youthful, the most plentiful are existing town meeting minutes and other town records. These are standard for all Massachusetts towns, the work of men in town who were active in local government. The second source is highly unusual, a woman's voice, that of the aforementioned experienced White Richardson, diarist, wife, mother, slave owner, in constant communication with God. I think you smile. Her diary, spanning over 40 years, including the years of 1763 to 1775, contains another element which is of interest. Experienced White Richardson was an ardent patriot. Her comments add a personal note to matters at hand, as in the first quote, fearing the impact of these perilous times on the country, on her town, and on her son. Surely other women shared her concerns when they met at church or aided in childbirths and cared for the sick outside their homes. Why did such a radical change occur in a relatively short time? At the signing of the Peace Treaty of Paris in 1763, ending the French and Indian War, Richardson wrote, "This day," and I quote her, "this day I have great cause to be thankful at the news of the general peace between the nations, and that it is upon such good terms, especially in this part of the world." And so the timeline is next. And the first is the French and Indian War. The British were in control of North America at its end, triumphing over France with the help of English colonists in America, including many men from Sudbury, such as Colonel, later General John Nixon, Joseph Smith, Moses Maynard, and experienced White Richardson's husband, Josiah, and her son, Josiah Jr., or their son. Nixon, Smith, and Josiah Jr. would also see action again on April 19, 1775. For Richardson, not only was the end of the last French and Indian War a triumph for the British, but a respite from war for North American Englishmen and personally for her own family. The 7 Years' War, however, had wreaked havoc on the treasury of Great Britain, and the British government saw an opportunity to replenish their empty coffers in the prosperous colonies across the sea, who were, after all, as they saw it, the main beneficiaries of this dearly bought peace on the North American continent. A series of acts aiming to raise money from the colonies would trigger a deadly downward spiral that would unleash the power of the aptly named mother country against what it saw as the indulged children in America. How many parents have faced, I'll raise my hand, the situation of trying to impose their will on their offspring to be met with anger and a will to resist? You're laughing, Courtney. And yes, one foolish British minister once put it like that. He actually said that. When the British government deemed as their right to tax, the colonists regarded as a violation of their rights as Englishmen, embodied at first in the well-known phrase, or the best-known phrase, no taxation without representation. And in keeping with that deadly downward spiral, the British government would respond to these protests by whittling away other rights of the colonies to force compliance. And nowhere was this more pronounced than in the province of Massachusetts, with customs and traditions going back to 1630. The charter had spelled out the terms of self-government that had been practiced throughout Massachusetts since its founding. Although many of the grievances protested had no major consequences in Sudbury, town meeting always responded with vigorous approbation to calls for support from Boston. Boston, a town which derived its living from the sea through trade and fishing, was much less self-sufficient than the people of the countryside, who could grow and make almost anything that they needed from their own land. However, Boston was the leading town in New England and the seat of British government in New England. And so the first downward spiral is the Stamp Act. So that's the next slide. Just thinking about the kids and disciplining. So the Stamp Act, I made that up. The first major protest on the path to war occurred over passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, the first time Parliament attempted to impose a direct internal tax on the American colonies. It taxed newspapers, legal papers, pamphlets, tavern license, playing cards, and more. While Britain had placed restrictions on the colonies as early as the Navigation Act starting in the mid-1600s, they were poorly enforced, and they turned a blind eye to smuggling by clever merchants. This would impact Sudbury, but only to a minor extent. Of course, it was Boston, the only seat of government that the people of Massachusetts had access to, that bore full force as a poor town that required lots of administrative documents and records. Yet Sudbury town meeting did not hesitate to come to the defense of Boston and the province. Their tone in town records was both respectful and forceful, and this is what it says. Professing the greatest loyalty and sincere affections to our most gracious sovereign, George III, and our sincere regard and most profound reverence and high esteem for the British Parliament as the most wise, powerful, and respectable body of men on earth. However, they went on, we, your constituents, being the royal charter heirs apparent to British liberties, can't be guilty of such horrid perfidiousness as to violate or tamely give it up, especially when we consider the vast expense, effusion of blood, and toil our forefathers have been at to procure it in cultivating a wilderness. We've been here for 135 years. Throughout the years, Sudbury men had taken part in the various expeditions during the French and Indian War, fighting alongside their fellow soldiers from Great Britain. Some had even paid the ultimate price and gave their lives. The townspeople of Sudbury were somewhat mollified when the Stamp Act was repealed, following protests and boycotts early in 1776. But their complacency did not last long. On the same day as the Stamp Act was repealed, something called the Declaratory Act was passed by Parliament, stating that Parliament had the right to make laws binding the colonies and the people. We're still the boss. The men of Sudbury had no voice in Parliament, which was made up solely of Englishmen, as you well know, who lived 3,000 miles from here, yet the significance of the Declaratory Act was not immediately obvious as people were rejoicing over the repeal of the Stamp Act. But then in 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, a series of British laws that imposed taxes on various goods imported to the American colonies, including glass, lead, paint, paper, and that nagging, persistent little word, tea, the beloved drink of the colonists, including those in Sudbury. It was one of the few non-essential luxuries that the people of Sudbury indulged in. Sudbury Town Meeting was swift in their support of Boston and indignation, unanimously voting, and I quote, a cheerful concurrence with the votes of the town of Boston at their meeting, also unanimously voted not to purchase any of the enumerated articles, also unanimously voted to use the utmost endeavors to promote industry, economy, and manufactories among them. The Townshend Acts sought to extract money from the colonists in a slightly different manner from the Stamp Act, so they were trying different ways. They were external taxes paid at the port of entry, not internal taxes. The revenue would go to pay the salaries of colonial governors previously paid by colonial legislatures and enlarge the customs system whose continental headquarters were in Boston. So the next slide is something that the Townshend Acts brought about, and that is the arrival of troops in Boston. I think that's in the wrong, okay? Yes, that's good. Okay, so here they're coming. Now added to the boycott of British goods came the call for more self-reliance in producing needed goods for local consumption. But again, the British powers that were 3,000 miles away were not pleased with the response by the colonists to this new attempt to replenish their treasury, and especially with the protests in Boston. In October 1768, several regiments already in North America, ordered by General Thomas Gage, we will hear from him again later, commander of the British forces stationed in America to protect its new North American acquisitions acquired from the French, were sent to Boston to expedite compliance with the township duties. Here's something important is occurring. The need for military preparedness by townspeople in the countryside, crystallizing the realization that it could happen in Boston, it could happen here in Sudbury or Wayland. What would stop the British soldiers from venturing out of Boston if they decided to do that? Already, these self-reliant and largely self-sufficient men had experienced the untrustworthiness or perfidiousness, as they called it, of the British government. They were all in this together. That spirit, I believe, was the key to arousing the colonies to action and seeing them through 8 years of war. It would only grow in time. So soon after the British troops arrived in Boston, Sudbury Town Meeting passed the following resolution, and I quote, "The town by their vote granted the sum of 11 pounds to make an addition to their town stock of ammunition and ordered that it should be 1 barrel of powder and the remainder in bullets and flints." Now we can go to the Boston Massacre. Thank you, Courtney. So this becomes even more evident after the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770, resulted in the death of 5 colonists. I found this thing that shows Crispus Attucks, who had once lived down Old Connecticut Path in Framingham, not far from the current Wayland town line. So by the time of the massacre, half the British troops in Boston had been withdrawn, and the rest would be withdrawn shortly after the massacre. But tensions remained high. Sudbury Town Meeting, again, voted to boycott all merchants who violated the boycott of British goods. And so they voted, quote, that they would abstain from the luxuries and superfluities of the times which had been so impoverishing to this country, especially the renowned plant tea. This is over 3 years before the Tea Party, a preview of the importance of this one item. So the next slide is perfidious tea. So coincidentally, on March 5th, 1770, the same day as the Boston Massacre took place, most of the township duties were repealed. It's sort of the carrot and the stick kind of game they're playing, were repealed with one exception. The tax on tea was to remain in force to prove the right that they had of taxing Americans. And note that it is said not Englishmen or North Americans, it is now Americans. The king and Parliament must have been at wit's end as to how to force the colonists, and particularly those awful Bostonians, to realize that they must obey their rightful masters, who seemed far more concerned with replenishing their depleted coffers than with respecting the rights of the colonists. Even at what became a fairly quiet period in relation to overt actions of protest, the radicals in Boston continued to spread propaganda. They were relentless, describing British mistreatment throughout the colonies far and wide through the Sons of Liberty and the committees of correspondence. The purpose was to fan the flames of resentment to the other colonies, which were experiencing some, but usually lesser mistreatment. For the communities near Boston, like Sudbury, British hostility and punishments in Boston had a more personal meaning. In 1771, Sudbury Town Meeting approved a new powder house and continued to seek arms and ammunition to store there. What were they thinking? And so we come to the final, I think, indignity, or one of the final ones, and that is, the next slide is the Boston Tea Party. So despite all the tumultuous events that have preceded it, it was the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, and the subsequent passage of the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, to punish the people of Massachusetts, that made armed conflict inevitable, that's my opinion. The Tea Act of 1773, passed by Parliament, precipitated the Tea Party. Parliament was well aware of the outrage that ensued when the hated Townshend duties were repealed without repealing the tax on tea. Upping the ante and guaranteeing the sympathies of the other colonies to the situation that had long prevailed in Boston. The Tea Act added insult to injury by attempting to help the financially troubled British East India Company sell 17 million pounds of tea that was stored in England. The Tea Act of 1773 rearranged excise regulations so that the company could pay the Townshend duty and still undersell its competitors. Parliament hoped that this would reinforce their right to levy direct taxes on the colonies. All colonies were affected, but as usual, the loudest voices came from Boston, and the loudest actions as well. The issue was no longer money, but rights. The deal with the East India Company was not to force the colonists to pay more for the tea they drank, but to exert control over the colonies. East India tea would actually cost less, undercutting the price of tea acquired from traders from other nations, especially the Dutch, undercutting the price, and Great Britain, other nations competing with Great Britain, especially the Dutch. At the time of the Tea Party, the estimate was that about 80% of the tea consumed by Massachusetts residents was smuggled tea. Smuggling had long been a way of life for Massachusetts merchants, and they were very adept at evading attempts by the British government to put an end to it. So I'm not recounting numerous instances of that, mercifully for you guys. So in January 1774, in response to the Boston Tea Party, Sudbury Town Meeting declared, and I quote, "The British ministry, assisted by the inveterate enemies to American liberty on this as well as the other side of the Atlantic, combining together to rob us of our dear-bought freedom, have brought us to the sad dilemma, either to resolve like men in defense of our just rights and liberties, or seek under the weight of their arbitrary and unconstitutional measures into a state of abject slavery. Therefore, as freeborn Americans entitled to all the immunities, liberties, and privileges of freeborn Englishmen, we look upon ourselves under the strongest obligations to use our utmost exertions in defense of our just rights in every method within our power." The march to Concord was still 14 months away, but there was little doubt that there would be a violent outcome. And so the punishment for this is the next slide. and that is the British response called the Intolerable Acts, which went into effect in the spring of 1774, imposed the harshest punishments on the colonies. The object was to force Boston, whose seaport was the lifeblood of the province, to pay for the destruction of the tea. The port of Boston would be closed until there was restitution. King George III nullified the charter of the province of Massachusetts on May 24, 1774, and installed General Thomas Gage, formerly head of the British forces in North America, and made him military governor, effectively placing Massachusetts under martial law. Towns, including Sudbury, could hold only one town meeting a year unless sanctioned by General Gage, who enlisted men loyal to the crown to carry out his orders. Of course, Sudbury soon violated that order. The 7 months before the outbreak of fighting on April 19, 1775, was a time of constant turmoil in Massachusetts, for every move by the colonists to assert their right to govern themselves, as they had since the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, General Gage, his troops, and the British government in London insisted, cajoled, threatened, instead of looking for a solution that might avoid bloodshed. Both sides continued to stockpile arms, with the meetings of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September of 1774, with all colonies represented except Georgia. The troubles in Boston were no longer a local affair, but an American affair. As experienced White Richardson duly noted in September of 1774, there is a great slurs, whatever that means, maybe Ellen could translate, and commotion in our nation as an army at Boston to distress us, and great danger of a civil war in our nation. This is September of 1774. And so now the next is preparations for war. This is a musket that is on display at the Sudbury Historical Society. The musket actually is a fowling piece belonging to a man named Ezekiel Rice, who actually lived on the east side of the river. But preparations for war after this went into high gear. In June 1774, Sudbury Town Meeting had voted to build a new powder house. Townspeople such as Sarson Belcher and tavern keepers Ezekiel Howe and Jacob Reeves procured arms and ammunition to put Sudbury in a position to defend itself and come to the aid of other communities if and when fighting broke out. There were still shortages on April 19, 1775, when the 300 men went to answer the alarm in Concord, but most men were at least equipped in some fashion. In October 1774, the General Court, which was the colonial legislature, including Sudbury's chosen representative, Thomas Plimpton, had been dismissed by General Gage and forbidden to meet. They reconstituted themselves into an extra-legal assembly, which took the name Provincial Congress, with Thomas Plimpton joined by James Mossman and Captain Richard Hurd, representing Sudbury at its first meeting held in Concord. On October 26th, the Provincial Congress, this is an illegal body, assumed control of it created the Minutemen as a rapid response force to supplement the militia. By November, the Provincial Congress had assumed control of the province and reorganized the militia for action and recommended that towns form minute companies for rapid response to attack. There were minute companies training in Sudbury by January 1775 as the pace of drills accelerated and the training fields were utilized on a regular basis. The town continued to stockpile arms and what ammunition they could get their hands on. No easy task as it was, by and large, imported and in great demand by all the other towns who were trying to stock weapons. So suspected Tories, also known as loyalists, were purged from the military. 3 Sudbury men were questioned, and we only know this from experienced White Richardson's diary. She's the only one who mentioned it. But only William Baldwin, a leader of the town, had to publicly recant in a Boston newspaper for previously showing support for the reviled ex-governor, Thomas Hutchinson. Harvard-educated and a classmate of the hated Loyalist Attorney General Jonathan Sewell, Baldwin played no role in the events of 1775 and was barred from town office until 1777. Although there is no evidence of his disloyalty, his crime, guilt by association, was enough to sideline him. So in March 21st, 1775, Sudbury had all their militia and minute companies in place, and with trusted commanders, John Nixon and Nathaniel Cudworth would respectively command minute companies on the west and east side, while Ezekiel Howe and Moses Stone, Joseph Smith, and Aaron Haynes commanded companies of the militia. Captain Isaac Loper commanded a troop of horse drawn from both sides of the river. Some were better equipped than others, as I said. Some had no guns, while some were equipped with bayonets and hatchets. But by and large, the store of weapons in town showed a vast increase over past years. While the townsmen were ever alert for a call to arms and tensions were building, they still had a town to run. Town meeting in March 1775 turned down, this is only a month before election, the right of horses and sheep to run free, but allowed it for the swine. I don't know why. And planting season was rapidly approaching. The men of Sudbury were ready for whatever was to come, but uncertainty still remained. After the Intolerable Acts took effect, there was little doubt that armed conflict would take place somewhere in Massachusetts. Time and place were still uncertain. It almost happened in Cambridge, modern Somerville, in September 1774 with the Powder House alarm, when British troops tried to seize colonial military stores. It could have happened in Salem at Leslie's Retreat, and while it would have taken longer for Sudbury forces to get there, there is no doubt that they were ready to respond whenever and wherever the fighting began. It could have happened in Worcester, where arms were stored and townspeople were eager to fight. In February 1775, British spies, Ensign de Bernier and Captain Brown, scoped out the route to Worcester, even passing through Sudbury. It was General Gage who had to make the decision as to which stores to plunder, and Concord, he decided, was the easiest destination for the British troops to make a quick foray into the countryside and the best odds for a quick return to Boston. And now the North Bridge is the last slide. But it did not turn out that way, thanks to men like the Sudbury Militia and Minutemen who left their town to come to the aid of nearby townsmen who were threatened. Why did they go? They say an Englishman's home is his castle, and Sudbury was their castle, where they cared for their families, and their families cared for them, their land and their livestock. It was where their ancestors plowed the soil and now rested in it. So simple and to the point, and very much in keeping with the sentiments of Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is how I always ended my bridge talk for years, who spoke the words in Concord years later, but just as true about Sudbury that day. It is the same quote, as I said, that I used, and this is the Emerson quote. Those poor farmers who came up that day to defend their native soil acted from the simplest instincts. They did not know it was a deed of fame they were doing. These men did not babble of glory. They never dreamed their children would contend who had done the most. They supposed they had a right to their corn and their cattle without paying tribute to any but their own governors. Of once proud English colonists were well on their way to becoming Americans. April 19th is now less than a month away, and thank you.
Did you run into any reference about where the powder house was?
Well, there was one in Sudbury, I know.
Repeat the question, probably.
Oh, where the powder house was.
With the microphone.
I don't know. Thank you, ma'am. Oh, I'm falling down on the job. Sorry about that. Is it on? Yes. I know there was one in Sudbury, and I think where that one was, which is pretty close to the east side. But I don't know where the one, it seems to be uncertain where the one was on this side. Unless you have, anybody else?
Was there one on this side definitely?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I don't know. But it wasn't far from the east side, but yes, it was definitely, and it does specify where the powder house was built in the town records. And I can tell you if I remember.
That would be interesting to know.
No, I will tell you.
Archaeological.
I will tell you.
Do you have any idea of the route that the people on the west side took?
Yes.
And when did they come together?
They didn't come together
okay.
until,
They-
okay, so there's two maps that are on websites.
Yeah.
I can send them to you, but one, a man named Don Hafner, who was doing work for Minuteman Park, and pretty much they agree. So we used to hear that the East Siders came to Miriam's Corner,
Yeah.
and that is not the latest word. And they seem almost certain that they came to a place called Brooks Hill or Hardy's Hill, which was almost into Lincoln. So they did not, only the west side went to the North Bridge, number one. They both went to Concord, but to different places in Concord. And they wouldn't have met each other until the retreat, when they got to that point and beyond. So yes, I could say, there are maps available. I was going to bring it in, I'm sorry I did not. Huh? But there's one that's the east, done by the west side, but it shows the east side, and Don's map shows both the east and west, and they pretty much agree with one another as to the route. It's still, nobody knows why the east side went where they went.
Right.
And that still has not been resolved.
Right.
Yeah.
But the river was probably hard to cross.
Well, they did, that
Spring to
was,
spring.
yeah, that was probably not an issue if they went up, but why didn't they go up? If they went up like 126, they would have been much closer. Than they were. They didn't go till, they almost were into Lincoln by the time. And why they took that route, we don't know. And nobody has come up with a plausible reason why they went where they did. Courtney?
One question online, is there any information on the amount of enslaved or free people of color who answered the alarm on April 19th?
In Sudbury, none. But they did to Bunker Hill. And yeah, you got the right person to ask that question. So yes, there were, ultimately there were 7 persons of color who did answer the call, but none of them went on April 19th.
How did the people get notification? Did they hear from church bells, or were there runners?
Yeah, there were bells, but there was also, I know on the west side it's supposed to be Samuel Prescott's brother. Nobody really knows positively who came to the east side. But that's, yeah. There seems to be more known about the west side response, but the church bells here in
What did
Wayland
Prescott
Center.
do?
Huh?
What did Prescott do?
Well, Samuel Prescott brought the alarm to Concord, and then it said that his brother Abel came to Sudbury, went to Sudbury, and who came to Wayland is again not known. To this side
To
of the
the east
river.
side.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
This is a two-parter.
Okay. I think easy.
Well, the person who submitted them says he's listening to this from Timothy Sherman's bedroom, who marched on April 19th with militia, and he'd love to hear more about him. But I don't know if you can do that off the cuff.
I can't.
Okay, so then maybe we can get back to him. But the question is, how connected to England or the UK would Sudbury residents have been? Were they writing home to cousins? How many would have ever traveled across the Atlantic?
Probably few or none. I don't know of any that did it. So really what they're relating to is being Englishmen here and of the English stock. But what they had to do with the mother country probably by the time they're established here for under 35 years, they probably didn't have too much.
So you might have just answered this, but how divided was Sudbury's response to the battles in Lexington and Concord? Were they somewhat uneasy about the need to shoot regulars to protect their rights?
It didn't seem like it by the time they got to do it. Sounds like they were raring to go. I mean, I think they really had felt that their rights were, I mean, they're arming. I mean, you can't ignore the fact that the response to what was going on was the English soldiers were arming and the ones here were arming. So what's going to happen when everybody's armed and stocking arms and everything else? How much does it take? But I leave that story to the militia, who will be playing a much bigger role on April 19th. I don't do the war story per se. I just take you to that and to that. How's that?
So you would say that the reason that the militia in Lexington didn't fire wasn't because they weren't worked up about it, but maybe they were completely outnumbered.
We don't know who gave the order to
Well,
fire.
they didn't, I don't think they fired at all, and they pulled back their.
No, they didn't fire.
But they were significantly outnumbered.
Well, I think they also just had no idea, this is the first, they're coming in town, they're breaking up, going in two directions, the British, and then finally went on to the Green, and that's where the fights began.
Right. And in Concord, the only reason that they charged the bridge was because they thought the British were burning the town.
Yes.
Apparently a big column of smoke went up
Yes.
in the square,
Yes.
and the colonists or the English or whatever.
Yes, will you let them burn the town down?
Exactly, so at that point, that's when they charged the British.
Yes.
The rest was history.
I mean, to me, it's like an accident waiting to happen. It's going to happen. You know, where it was going to happen, it could have happened in Somerville or Cambridge on the 4th of, September of 1774. Could have happened in Salem if they hadn't backed down and negotiated a stalemate. Worcester was ready and they were protesting, so it was gonna happen, but, you know, I don't know if it's good or bad or lucky or not lucky, but it happened in Concord and the men of Sudbury were available to participate in it. Which is quite, you know, I think for me always it was quite a thrill for the years I spent at the North Bridge, but thinking that the people in my town, the kids that for many years that I did programs for, that they were going to go to Minuteman, that they actually could see where it happened rather than read about it, see videos about it, to be actually standing there. Was a thrill to me as well, that I'm standing where the war began. It is, it's a, you know, you don't do it if you don't have any feelings for what you're doing. Yes?
Do we know how many casualties there were in the Sudbury militia?
Yeah, there were, I can't remember, it's easy, I didn't do maybe 3 or something.
Out of how many?
Well, there were about 300 that left.
300.
300?
How many casualties from Sudbury?
No, I said about 3 out of,
3
you said
out.
how many went?
3 out of
Gina.
300.
Is it beyond the scope to talk about the fighting techniques? Because it seemed like from the French Indian War and other events, maybe we had a different way of going about fighting than
Yeah,
Brits.
we knew where we were. We knew how to get there. We knew where rocks and you know, barriers were. The British were taught to fight in street firing formation, yeah. So I mean, a lot of the way back, which I'm only telling you because I did it as a ranger, because I'm not infringing on the April 19th celebration, but yeah, we knew where the stones were, we knew where the trees were, we knew where everything. They didn't know what they, you know, where they were or what they were doing. Unfamiliar. Same reason I think we have slaves who were African rather than Indian, because the Indians knew the territory, and the people who came from Africa or other parts did not. So yeah, it's a great advantage to know the land.
Was the weaponry about the same, or just
Huh?
was it the weaponry about the same in terms of the kinds of
A
muskets?
lot of what was here were fowling pieces, probably a lot of pieces left over from the French and Indian War. The British had their brown death muskets, and were taught to teach it. But what we were really lacking here was the use of ammunition. That was the hardest part. It wasn't the weapons as much as it was the availability of ammunition, and of course everybody's looking for ammunition because they're all arming themselves, all the surrounding areas. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the Native American, the Native Americans who were here. I think it was the Pequot, and I don't recall what else was local, but so when the British came over, and what happened to the Native Americans during that time?
Well, a lot of them had already been infected by European illness, and I think there was something like 80-some-odd% of the population that was decimated right off the bat, but they kept trying to push them away. And the history of the Native Americans, well, some of you might know I wrote a book about slavery, and I could only talk about African slavery because I could not document any Indian slavery that ever happened, and I'm sure there was, but I could not document any, and nobody that was expert in the field was able to give me any leads on that.
But some of the local Native American populations would have been going to the praying Indian towns that
Yeah.
John Eliot would have founded.
And we had, there was a great connection of the African American community or African community in Sudbury to the praying Indians community. I was surprised because of years I worked in Concord, really their orientation of enslaved people was not, but for Sudbury, the affinity, the closeness was with the praying Indian community. And maybe, first of all, a black enslaved man who married a free praying Indian woman had children, your children were free if they had children.
Thank you.
Thank you.